Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. When NEAL ADAMS passed away April 28th, I knew I had to put together more than just one webinar dedicated to his legacy. I started out a week after he passed away with Adam's overview, pretty much an overview of his entire career. And then starting with Dead Man, I concentrated on his significant bodies of work. Batman had to be split up into two webinars, May 18th and May 19th. His Green Lantern, Green Arrow series, his Marvel works. Superman Ali was not only just that epic work, but also his significant body of Superman works that preceded the Ali project. Then last week, Adams ECLECTICA Part 1, and tonight, ECLECTICA Part 2. These are the graphics I put together for them, and I really had a great time presenting these. They were a lot of work, but man, it was just worth it to share with you so much of his great artwork in all these different categories. And now tonight, to finish it with what I call Adams ECLECTICA. Last week was part 1 from 62 to 71. Tonight, part 2, 1972 till I think he was working right up until he passed away in this year. So let's start, folks, with 1972. And I couldn't think of a better piece to debut the year 72 than this close-up of the program book cover showing Neal's greatest DC characters. And then I think he threw in Star Trek just for good measure. But then there's this 1972 illustration that grouped together so many of his famous characters from DC and Marvel. There's Atomic Mouse. But who's that character in the middle with the initials JC and a halo? Could that be the Son of God himself? Or should I say Son of God? Because in the pages of National Lampoon magazine, this feature debuted. You can see the credits there, Lampoon writer, regulars, Sean Kelly and Michael Choquette, illuminated by NEAL ADAMS. This appeared in the January 72 issue of the great late National Lampoon magazine. Magazines, unlike comics, came out the month they were dated. So I'm assuming this hit the stands at the beginning of the year. So why Son of God? Well, in the early 70s, you know, the subject of Jesus Christ came from out of the counterculture into the mainstream. Productions like Godspell, I think, was started in 1970. And then I think Jesus Christ Superstar follows in 71. Now, you Adams aficionado, if you're thinking of his great Christ work of the year 1972, that would, of course, be the final issue in the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series, dated May of 72. But that means comics are dated 3 to 4 months in advance. It came out February or March, a month after Son of God debuted in National Lampoon. So we don't have time to go through all 12 pages, but to kind of give you the highlights, you know, they got NEAL to just draw you know, there's a frustrated Mort Drucker and Neal Adams, and when he did his National Lampoon stuff like this, he got to exercise the lighter, the comedic side of Neal, yet never losing the realism that was what made him the great Neal Adams. So these National Lampoon works, beginning with Son of God, are really Neal wearing multiple hats as a storyteller, not sacrificing his drawing prowess, and giving the Lampoon the same quality of comic work that he was doing for DC and Marvel. But I love the visual gags that Neal pulled off, like the bottom panel of the puppeteer, the papal puppetry, as it were. And the Grand Inquisitor is Neal's great. You can see in that close-up in the bottom right how, you know, Neal's art at this point is at its drawing prowess peak. But again, you know, he didn't take it easy when he did National Lampoon. Benny David takes the name, but now I'm not going to explain the whole Son of God thing. You can kind of get the gist of what I've been showing you while I've been talking. The little Brooklyn Nudnik is transfigured. This is a job for Son of God. Commie, peace, creep, hey, fruit, get a haircut. I like homo. National Lampoon. How's that for a great shot? Like I said, Neal didn't skimp when he worked for National Lampoon. Meets the devil. Get thee behind me, say, you see, give it up, you little kike. You are powerless in the grip of my Jesuit lot. These things, they just remind me how fun they were. So it's the same month that this came out, dated January of 1972, even though, again, this came out in late 71 and Neal did it. It just made it easy, organizationally wise, to follow the printed dates in terms of organizing Neal's work chronologically. Now, this is, of course, the great Joe Kubert, but why am I showing you this? Obviously, Neal had work inside, a short story, a science fiction story, another time, another place, pretty groovy typography, Neal. But notice the credit, the story was by Bob Haney. Now, 4 years earlier, Neal, you know, resurrected Batman in a single issue with his, you know, made his bones character Dead Man in stories written by Bob Haney, 8 Brave and Bolds between 68 and 69 that are, you know, where Neal remade Batman for the modern era. But here he is teaming up with Haney. And that means, of course, working DC style. I can only assume Haney wrote a full script, but you never know by this time with Neal how he was working with writers, because there was no documentation of any of this. You know, Neal didn't give interviews about specifics like this, so we can only surmise. But what we do know is that Neal colored the work because these are his color guides. Pretty cool. Those are watercolor dyes on black and white photostats, and then they're marked up with the letters and numbers to relate to the printer, how to cut what color screens to achieve those colors. I'm assuming Neal did these colors, but I can't be sure. But the fact that these color guides exist, how's that for a double page spread? And, you know, Neal is inking this, not Dick Giordano. And when I worked for Neal, I asked him, Neal, you were so busy in those days, so in demand. How did you find time to ink, you know, some of your work? And he said, Arlen, I always made time to ink the stories that were special. That was the phrase he used. And he must have really liked this Bob Haney story enough to not only just draw it, but pencil it and ink it. and probably color it. So you can see our space explorer. You can look great facial expressions by Neal. And again, without getting into the whole story, obviously they thought they were fighting an enemy, and out steps a monster very much resembling the Earth GIs, an alien adversary with the capabilities of destroying himself and the universe, just like us. Reminds me of an old Ditko Amazing Fantasy story. I should have shown it in comparison, but I digress. In 1972, Neal did work for fanzines, or very slick fanzines. I would almost call Heritage a prozine. But in 1972, they did a special issue on Flash Gordon, and Neal contributed 4 full-page, black and white. These look like pencils with gray tones added, wash tones. I wish I had a higher resolution of this one, but you get a sense of it. Same thing. I couldn't find a better resolution. That sky shouldn't look like that. But again, only Neal would attempt to draw an animal from there's not necessarily photo reference for that, folks. I love this final illustration of Neal grouping John Carter with Tarzan in the pneumatic tube. That's pretty cool. So Neal could travel in the same time period from outer space science fiction to underground New York City, subway coming at you. If you remember from Eclectica Part 1, the great Phantom Stranger covers he started to do in 1969. So here we are at the beginning of 1972. And this is actually one of my favorites of I think he turned out a total of 15 or 16 covers between 69 and 72. But 2 months later, look at this mini masterpiece. By the way, DC shifted to this 25-cent format. So look how they added the binding to the actual front cover so that you were forced to have to read that crap. But let's notice the beautiful Neal illustration. And I'm bringing it down a little so that when I show you, this is the thumbnail sketch, folks. Remember, this is 1/4 of the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper if you split it up into 4 quadrants. And then Neal would blow this up and make a tight pencil, which we have no record of, unfortunately. But we do have records of some of his inks, like this one. And again, this is as high resolution as I could present it for you while maintaining the integrity of it looking like a piece of original art. But look how much Neal's great color. I'm assuming Neal colored these covers. They're just too gorgeous. That choice of blue in the background is just such an inspired choice. It really makes the whole cover come alive. And everybody's wondering, why weren't Neal's Marvel covers as great as his DC covers? Well, folks, here's a perfect example. April of 1972 at DC and April of 1972 at Marvel. You tell me why one is better than the other. You know, Neal says they messed with his covers at Marvel. Between the intrusive type, which is bad enough, but even the illustration, the Dracula face looks like John Romita might have retouched it. The girl, it doesn't, and the way it's inset and not done full bleed. You know, here's June's Phantom Stranger cover. This is actually the last one Neal did. And again, less intrusive type, full bleed, no weird borders. That would actually come to his covers at DC later, but how about this thumbnail sketch? These are just jeweled miniatures, folks. And you can just see how much he retains in the finished art. The same month in Marvel. No, that's not a Neal cover. That's, of course, the great John Buscema. But I must be showing you this because could there be a hidden treasure? Notice the bottom caption, "Terror stalks the Everglades." Huh. Yes, it's Marvel's version of Swamp Thing. It's Man-Thing. Man-Thing actually came first. I showed this last week in Eclectica 1, but just to recap, a year earlier, May of 1971, in Marvel's black and white magazine with a John Buscema Conan painted cover, there was the debut of the Marvel Man-Thing, illustrated by Gray Morrow. And I believe Jerry Conway, I think, wrote the story or created him. Because it wasn't until 2 months later that Wrightson and Len Wein did their famous Swamp Thing debut in this issue of House of Secrets. So technically, Man-Thing precedes Swamp Thing by a couple months, kind of like the Doom Patrol and the X-Men, you know, DC and Marvel. But getting back to Neal's, this is a real incredible, I mean, it's the definition of eclectica. It's reproduced from Neal's pencils, and it's a flashback within a flashback. There's a larger story drawn by Buscema, but you get to page 10, all of a sudden, it's illustrated by Neal from his pencils with, again, beautiful colors on the left and monochrome on the right. I mean, just the beauty of this is Neal's rendering at its peak. And this gives you an example of what's been lost to comic art history. The loss of Neal's tight pencils that exist only in, you know, low resolution images like this. But the pencils that were inked are lost to the ages because nobody kept Xeroxes. But when you see a tightly penciled story like this for reproduction, then you get a sense of what was lost to comic art history. Look at the sense of light in that woman's face. And it's a Black woman's face. Again, Neal was a master of being able to render multiple races and ethnicities and genders like no other artist of his time, and I would wager since. Once again, there's a John Romita woman patch for whatever reason, whoever made the decision, whether it was Stan Lee or somebody else, Roy Thomas, I don't know. But man, talk about marring a master's work. How dare they? And just what you've been waiting for, folks. Neal doing his Man-Thing after Gray Morrow did his a year ago. This is only the second appearance of Marvel's Man-Thing, and it's by Neal. And it just shows you that he could do any genre and master it. How about that last panel? Great close-up. The woman rushes up to Man-Thing. These are the kind of emotions that Neal was able to get across in his drawing. That bottom left panel is just beautiful. The contrast, the woman's posture and Man-Thing's. Bad guy gets his gun. How about that shot? And the last two panels. That shows you the difference between Neal able to do human emotion and even out of a monster. A couple months later, this Phantom Stranger cover would appear, August of '72. And then in December, he would complete his trifecta of that year with a cover for Marvel's Man Thing. But again, there's something about Neil's Marvel's covers. It's the same artist, but you know, I'll take the DC version over, but it's still a beautiful cover. Meanwhile, back in July of 72, I jumped ahead there, another Kubert cover. Why? What could there be inside this beautiful Kubert cover? Could that be, yes, a Neal Adams El Diablo story, DC's Zorro knockoff, written by Superman writer Cary Bates. But look who does the inks, Bernie Wrightson. If you saw Eclectica #1 and the Green Lantern webinar, you know that Bernie inked a couple of Neil's pieces there in those two webinars. But here, he inks Neil's first El Diablo story. I'm not sure if he also did the colors, but if they're beautiful, then he did them. I'm not showing you every single page of the story. Let me get to the ending. Where'd that knife come from? The comatose grandfather that he thought was still alive. This old warrior has been dead for several days. So, a couple months later, September of 72. Why am I showing you a Nick Cardy flash cover? Look at the blurb down below. Starting in this issue, the award-winning Green Lantern, Green Arrow. What the? First of all, notice they spell Neal Adams, N-E-I-L. Oh, that's unforgivable. But how is this possible? Didn't we just discuss the last issue of the series was earlier that year, May of 72? Well, the last page of this issue carried this announcement. The powering adventures of the Emerald Crusader will continue as a co-feature in the Flash, beginning with it. So they planned this well in advance. And look at Green Arrow in the inset. Don't forget me, Green Arrow, I'll be around. Sometimes with GL, sometimes doing a solo adventure. Fire that copywriter. Well, what had happened in the meantime was that they were able to strike a book deal to reprint the Green Lantern, Green Arrow stories of 70 to 72 in 2 paperbacks. And for them, the first cover, they reprinted just the interior panels, but check out the back cover. This is a kind of a redo by Neil of the famous panel from the very first Green Lantern, Green Arrow story of April 1970. But look at this pencil that exists of him redrawing that with Green Arrow now in the center. And then the other cover is sort of a revise of another issue of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series that dealt with Native American rights. And there's Green Lantern in a kind of totem pole crucifix position, which is much more apparent here. Interesting that a year earlier in 1971, Neil had done this beautifully colored Superman cover of a similar composition that he kind of reworks in this composition. Okay, getting back to the first backup story. It's all about the fact that Green Arrow has a moment of crisis that brings his whole career into focus when he misfires in a shootout and kills a guy. And that's essentially what the first, I think these were 10-page backups, but we'll come back to the second issue, but that lays out the essential conflict of the story. Meanwhile, back in Weird Western Tales, could it be behind this? This looks like a Tony DeZuniga cover, I believe. One of the great Filipino artists. Was he Filipino, DeZuniga? But anyway, we're in September of '72. And another Carrie Bates El Diablo story, interestingly titled Night of the Living Dead, 4 years after the first George Romero movie. But no inks by Bernie Wrights, and this time Neal pencils and inks an El Diablo story. Now, if you were here last time and I showed you Neal's Tomahawk covers, you know how much Neal loves to draw horses. And I think that's what probably attracted him. But remember what I told you, the fact that he inked this story shows you how much he was into it and into the character. He probably loved Zorro and jumped at the chance. And once again, look at the fine line of his inking, even in this low resolution version I was able to find. And just the amount of work Neal put into these drawings and the inking is just really beautiful to behold. And now we get the first appearance of Neal's El Diablo, penciled and inked. And how about that? It's like what he was doing with Batman and just translated to Zorro. And once again, you can get a sense that fine line cross hatching and his spotting of blacks on the outlaw's vest is just Neal's mastery of inking to make you, the reader, understand what kind of texture that is. Oh man, how about just the beautiful coloring of this page, especially the gradations and the zipatone down below. And how about its facing page? Oh, I mean, this is Neal Adams, folks, at his penciling, inking, and rendering peak, and coloring, because once again, we do have his marked up color study. Look at those tones and below, and the classic, you know, high-o silver position of El Diablo's horse. And folks, that's Ben-Day, old school Ben-Day dot coloring. I mean, that's as best as I could reproduce it for a webinar, but find the newsprint originals if you can, and you'll love them. The final confrontation. You know, Neal's mastery of physics, you feel the weight of those bags filled with gold sailing over El Diablo's body as he ducks to avoid it. And then the horses. Again, beautiful coloring, beautiful inking. Great close-up at the end. The warm colors of the end panel, the fireplace against the cool nighttime colors. Just gorgeous. Back to National Lampoon, October of '72. Could it be in their special issue on the 60s? Now, this obviously is not Neal. You can see it's signed by Ross Andrew and Mike Esposito, one of the great penciler inker teams of DC Comics. So for whatever reason, Neal didn't do the cover of this next installment of it's not Son of God, It's the Ventures of Zimmerman. Now, the fact that this piece of art exists, it's been in my files for years, tells me that maybe this was Neal's cover, and could it have been rejected? Don't ask me why they would, you know, kind of, but maybe Neal was too busy to draw the cover. I don't know, but he does draw the interior of this very satirical, very funny take on the story of Bob Dylan as representative of the 60s. And you can get a sense, once again, the lighter side of Neal. So it's not quite caricature. It's still Neal's realism, but it's lighter. These inks look like maybe Dick Giordano. This doesn't look like a Neal penciling inking job. And again, I wish we had time to, you know, kind of read the story together, but I think you can get a sense of the satire. But also, you know, when Neal would pop in for a close-up of Dylan, like in the bottom right there, it was always worth it. Look how years later, decades later, in this issue of Guilt and Pleasure, with the subtitle Making Jews Talk More, nice, from fall 2007, they did a whole article, an analysis of that Zimmerman story. So if you've never read it, I guess it's worth tracking down. Same time, November of 72, speaking of Jewish subject matter, you get a World War II Golem mashup in this cover by Neal. I bring it down a little just to show you Neal's quarter-page thumbnail sketch. Notice the foreground, very, very different from what ended up being the background. I mean, the foreground. So whether Neal self-edited or that was the editor, Kubert. Okay, back to the Flash, November of 72, the second of the three-part story. It begins with a bang, obviously. Nice Green Lantern close up there. You can see the Dick Giordano inks in close up are not as fine line as Neal's own inks. There's just something always missing in Giordano's inks. You don't get that sense in Tom Palmer when Palmer inked him back in the day. But we talked about that during the Marvel Works webinar. So Green Arrow is in turmoil and flies away from the scene of the crime, so to speak, as they recap the story here. Nice close-up. But yeah, he goes to the Himalayas to kind of find the wise man, so to speak, and get wisdom and lose himself. Help me, holy man. Help me forgive myself. Nice shot of Green Lantern with his power battery. And then a nice shot. Classic foreshortening by Neal. And a nice overhead shot of Green Lantern flying above. The story ends with a nice phantom-like figure of Green Arrow projected by Green Lantern's powering. Anyway, as the year draws to a close, we close the way we opened up 1972 with Son of God number 3. Again, Neal never skimped when he did work for National Lampoon. This is as detailed as anything he was doing for Marvel or DC. Same thing with these interiors. Power to the papal, like it. Neal has what we Jews call a Yiddish cup. He's a mensch with a Yiddish cup. He's a righteous Gentile. He's one of us. We love him. How about this double page spread of the U.S. map and great Grand Inquisitor in the foreground. But yeah, this is the lighter side of Neil. You know, when he gets to cartoon it up a little bit. How about this transformative panel of Benny turning into, I say, taking the name, as the little schnook takes the name. He is touched by the power of the Lord. Rama Lama Ding Dong. And once more, the word is made flesh. Make haste, HG. Holy Ghost. Round up the 12 apostles. The hour is at hand. Anywho, somehow we get to the end of the story, and look what happens down there at the end. Let's get that long-haired New York beatnik. I came unto my own, and my own received me not. Could it be? Is this the end of Son of God? Well, let's see what happens in 1973. We go from the Son of God to the Son of Hell, the Tomb of Dracula. Here's another Neil Marvel cover. This is less cluttered than Tomb of Dracula #1 from the previous year of 72. But once again, in the same month, over at DC Comics, you get this beautiful cover by Neil. Another El Diablo mini masterpiece. Neil loves to draw horses. Did I mention that? I mean, look at that beautiful thumbnail sketch. Maybe this is, again, a quarter page of an 8.5 by 11. And that is Neil's sketch. That's not a tight pencil, folks. That is a sketch with a marker, a felt tip marker. And again, we're missing the penciling stage. We're missing the inking stage. But it just shows you what went into these. The third Carrie Bates story that Neil loved enough to ink. And it is yet another mini masterpiece by Neil at his rendering prowess, at his greatest. Look at that horse. Now, in my Neal Adams sketchbook that I put together, here's a double-page spread where I took the thumbnail sketch of that great panel, which was, again, maybe 3 inches wide, and blew it up and added, that's Neil talking about this particular sketch, or he didn't think this was a good drawing. Do you believe it? If you read the tiny copy there on the bottom right. But look how much the finished art keeps the vibrancy of that sketch. I mean, that is why Neil wanted to draw El Diablo, I think, for drawings like that. Or maybe drawings like this. I mean, look at this page that I'm showing you. I mean, that is a masterpiece of comic book art storytelling, of narrative, of design, of penciling, everything, coloring. Yeah, only Neil would draw, you know, El Diablo bending over and firing from between his legs and make it not only not look awkward, but look cool. Like everything Neil drew looked cool. And I mean, Neil, master storyteller. Classic 3-panel cinematic progression. The final panel. The beautiful black and white pen and ink. Again, all of his horse drawings are just gems. Meanwhile, back in the flash backups, it's January of 73. Oh, I went too fast. Hold on. Sorry, folks. Let's go back to that. Yeah, so January 73. That's Neil the storyteller showing you how much tension you can build and release on a single page and make it come alive. And the graphic designer in Neil, it's not prominent, but his design of the sound effects, that's what a screeching car makes in a city street. I mean, it's really beautifully designed, and it makes your eye interweave in between those panels. And even though you see the crash on the page, Neil the storyteller is able to still make you focus on those top three panels as if you don't know what's coming, and yet you do. That's mastery of storytelling, that Neil could make you focus on the triptych of panels at top, even though you know the result. It's not like in a film where you can't see the next, scene or the cut. On a comic page, you have to present the whole scene at once. But the physics of how a car smashes into a phone booth and its resultant broken glass, I mean, as a pure drawing, with Black Canary being, hurled from it, is just, wow. That's great. Oh, by the way, this final installment is not inked by Dick Giordano, so these are Neil inks you're going to be seeing. That's why this particular page is gorgeous, because if you study, especially in the black and white version, look at the beautiful inking of those figures in the upper right corner. That's classic Neil shading. And look at the beautiful detail on those 4 Green Lantern figures below that upper right panel. The one of him coming into the room, and just look at the way he uses force lines, the billowing of the drapes. You feel that breeze that body would make coming in. Great coloring in the upper left panel. Yeah, Neil colored this one. Look at those tones on the old man's face in the upper right panel. And once again, the 1/4 page thumbnail of this page. This is a 1/4 of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, folks. And look at how I used it in my sketchbook. I just took that face, blew it up, and ghosted it behind Neil talking about sketching. And notice I tied it in with what he was saying. There are people who will say of the things that they like about my work that they like the intensity of the close-ups and the camera angles and the emotion of the things. And I think I got that from doing a syndicated strip. Yep. That's what Ben Casey was all about. Once again, folks, the coloring is gorgeous. That bottom right triptych, I mean, the bottom triptych. A lot of nice line work on the right, folks, in each panel. And then the final panel, there's Black Canary recovering from the telephone booth crash. And there in this circa early 70s sketch, She looks like she's in fine form, I should say. All of these sketches look dated 72, but many of them are not dated. But you can usually, if you're an Adams aficionado, you can tell the era, not only by his signature sometimes, but just the more you know his drawing. These all come from the early mid 70s at the latest. There's one dynamic duo. And here's another dynamic duo by Neil. Now, why am I showing you this 1968 early Neil World's Finest panel? Because there's an article, artist dropped Superman for advertising. I don't have a date on this article, but it's circa 1973. And this was the year that Neil made his transition out from working most of the time up at DC's offices by day. And then I think he would go home at night and work at night at home. But that's why he did so many covers in them, because he was right there in the offices. But circa 72, 73, he makes the move out of DC and gets his own office, which would, of course, be called Continuity. And that's when he partners with his inker partner and future DC exec, Dick Giordano, in this classic self-promotion piece that they were offering the New York City advertising art world their services, doing storyboards, animatics, comp art, using comic book artists. If you've been following the self-promotion piece. Here's a photograph of Neil with a young Carl Potts, who has since gone on, of course, to become a very well-known and well-respected artist, editor, writer, teacher at School of Visual Arts. But here he's being taught by Neil. So again, this is circa early 70s, 1973. And these are the kind of comic book style ads they were turning out. It was mostly Neil doing the art, but his assistants, like Carl Potts, would gather photo reference. They would maybe do the under pencil drawing, and then Neil might come in and ink everything. So there's no clear-cut records, but these early print campaigns look like they're all Neil, but maybe some of them are ink. You know, I think these pop-off vodka ads, because they relied on Neil's master expression. These look like full pencils and inks by Neil. And they did all types of advertising art. And again, Neil would do the underground, the under base drawing, but like these inks look like Giordano or others. Whereas an ink like this, yes, that's him. Early 70s, that looks like classic Neil pencils and inks. The height of realism, yeah. Hard to remember that he was once, you know, like a Bill Cosby type beloved celebrity. Loved by kids, just like Cosby. How ironic. In the middle of the 70s, you know, this looks like it could have been done for National Lampoon, but I believe this is a standalone, you can see in the top right, written and distributed as a free public service by the U.S. Information Agency and National something for social sanitation. I think this is a real anti-VD comic book style piece by Neil. It's in that kind of Son of God, National Lampoon style. But for all I know, it might be a National Lampoon gag strip. You know, I consider myself a Neil aficionado, but Neil put out so much work that, you know, I certainly don't know the provenance of every single piece, but I can just present it to you for your edification and enjoyment. But, you know, commercial advertising using superheroes, Capital, Tape Man. Remember cassette tapes, folks? So these look like Giordano inks with Neal's pencils and layouts, maybe. I'm not sure where these ran. Could they have run in Rolling Stone? 1973 also showed you the debut of a reel ahead of its time. It was really pre-Star Wars, live on Broadway. It started out in Chicago, and Neal got involved with it and ended up designing the poster, the sets, the costumes, the characters. Here's Neal doing his science fiction kind of Mike Hinge type style. The playbill, it had a brief run in the spring of 1963. Interesting costumes, weird cod pieces. I always thought, even when I was a kid getting this stuff. But you can see how some of the costumes were translated by the production people of Neal's designs. I mean, in earlier late 60s or early 70s fanzines like this, you can see that Neal was already experimenting with that type of costume. And then the main character, who, by the way, was recently on the cover of Compa Creators, 2015, the great editor John Cook put together a special feature on the whole history and saga of Warp. So folks, if you really wanted to know everything about this interesting and ahead of its time creation, check out this issue of Compa Creator. Obviously, he got Neal to do it. I think that's a new cover, but the signature looks old. So maybe this is an old piece of Neal's. But it's interesting that this came out in 73, and later in 73, May, this is not Neal, that's John Romita. But notice the character looks very much like the character for Warp. And yet, this was a Marvel comic based on War of the Worlds, inspired by, but it ended up being an aborted project. Neal only drew a few pages. A young Howard Chaykin took on the rest. The inking, like all the inking Neal got at Marvel that wasn't Tom Palmer, was heavy-handed. But you be the judge. These were some of the pages that Neal created. And we happen to have the thumbnail. Keep in mind, folks, Neal took this thumbnail, made a tight pencil that we don't have, and gave it to the inker who inked it like this. The inking's not bad. It's just, like I said, a little heavy-handed. Kind of like the John Verpoorten inking he got on some of his Inhumans that I showed you last month. Last month, the Marvel webinar. This black and white exists to give you an idea. Now, this page has been in my files, I'm assuming, because it looks definitely like War of the Worlds. But boy, remember I told you Neal liked to draw horses? I mean, wow, look at all the energy in this piece. Again, I don't know, it's an outtake with whether this was supposed to be a page for it. We do know that this is one of the few pencils, tight pencils of Neal's that exist, that give you an idea of what Neal's tight pencils were like versus the thumbnails I've been showing you. I wish I had higher resolution, but man, this just shows you how great Neal's pencils were. A month or two later, or was this the same month, July? Now, yeah, 2 months later, under a Nick Cardy Action Comics cover, you can see right away the inking by Dick Giordano, even though these are pencils by Neal, there's like something missing. It's not quite, and the coloring is drab. Neal didn't color this. The Human Target was a master of the skies, and I think he's still a character in the DC universe, but You know, it was a coup back in those days for, let's see, who was the writer? Len Wein? Yeah, he created Human Target. To get Neal Adams back in the day to do your creation in their debut was a coup. But remember, Neal drew Len Wein and Marv Wolfman's first published story for DC, that great Batman story that I showed you in the Batman webinar. Anywho, back to National Lampoon under a great, God, these keyboards are so sensitive. Under a classic Frank Frazetta cover, we have Son of God. Oh yeah, this is Son of God #3 because Zimmerman came in between, I think, Son of God 1 and 2, right? Or it became in between 2 and 3. But how ahead of its time, 50 years ago, battling the scourge of Islam. This was before the Yom Kippur War, 1973. And here we have nice full figure of Son of God. And the story ends with a great classic Neal foreshortened. So in the same year, we go from the Son of God once again to the Son of Satan, and Neal's iconic Dracula story that many people, including the writer Marv Wolfman, they consider this Neal's single greatest art job. So I'm going to show it to you in full. It was underneath this cover, not by Neal. I think that's a Gray Morrow painted cover, but I might be wrong. Everybody thinks the story is under Neal's great Dracula cover, but this was the next issue of Dracula Lives that Neal did the cover for, not the issue that has his great interior story. But you can see this is shot from the original art. So wash tones by Neal, on top of beautiful pen and ink line work. And you can really see how much work Neal put into this story. So once again, he must have really loved it. And the chance to do the origin of Dracula was something Neal, a Dracula fan, could not pass up. Now I'm showing you, this is a double page spread because look at the half page thumbnail of this spread. Obviously, all that center image he didn't doodle out yet, but remember folks, this is half the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And look at how much is retained in the finished art. Remember, we're lacking the tight pencil stage. Now, I'm going to zoom in on this top section. Why? Because from my sketchbook, this double page spread, look at what Neal says here. One of my favorite exercises is just changing styles and throwing myself into it completely. People say they recognize my style, but the different stories that I do are done in different styles. This was a short story done for the Morrow Black and White magazines and Wash. And it shows that there's a definite approach taken with each story. This is more of an illustrative story, not necessarily technique-wise, but compositionally. There's more breaking up a space in a more generous way for certain things. And then Neal decides to do a spot color for red, for blood. What do you think of that, folks? Pretty ballsy. Now, there was something about this close-up that I used a thumbnail sketch in my sketchbook of Neal's. Because again, folks, this drawing is maybe an inch high. you know, maybe 2 inches at the most. But look at how much of it is in the final. Yeah, and Neal, you know, master of angles, the head on the upper right. Ah, there's that great spot color. Great figure work. Oops. Screwed up there. Meant to have a nice dissolve. And there we have it, folks. Neal's Origin of Dracula story. Yeah, the next issue would feature his great painted cover, which started out as this thumbnail sketch. I'm not sure how big that is, but it's still a beauty. There's the painted version without all the type. Also, in 1973, somewhere around that time, there used to be a tabloid professional magazine called the Monster Times, very much like Famous Monsters of Filmland. But inside this particular issue, under a Neal cover, is Neal doing another Dracula type image. During, again, the early 70s, Neal would pop up with Dracula drawings like this. So Neal loved monsters. Here's another Swamp Thing, November of 73. I'm sorry, Man Thing. And I bring it down a little because I want to show you Neal's original painting. He was using what are called Dr. Martin's dyes, I believe. They're watercolor dyes, similar to coloring that he was coloring, you know, photostats for. He just meshed it with his pen and ink drawing and came up with his painting style. Out of nowhere, in January of 74, maybe Joe Kubert was, you know, called him up and said, Neal, I have to do the GI Combat cover. Maybe Joe was busy. And Neal just jumped in the middle of 1970, I mean, the beginning of 74. But 74 is the year that this cover came out. And why am I showing it to you on the left side of the screen? Because it was a wraparound cover. Those are the Warp characters on the right and Neal's DC characters, and they're fighting it out. This is the first publication about Neal's work. It came out in 1974, called the Neal Adams Index. There was the inside front cover, one of Neal's great Conan drawings. It had one of the first interviews with Neal. I think this might have been the first published interview since Neal interviewed himself in the very first Spectre story he drew in 1968. And I remember poring over every word. It was only a 1 or 2 page interview, but this was the magazine where we got to see for the first time this image of what could have been. It's the first time we saw this image. Yep, that's our Batman. A couple of years ago, John Cook asked me to color this cover for a feature he was doing about Warp. He ended up not using it, but there's my color version done in Photoshop of that classic black and white masterpiece of Neal's. April of 74, Neal does his first painted cover of many for Marvel's new magazine line, The Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. The same month at DC Comics, in April of 74, under the Nick Cardy cover, there would be Neil's last Green Lantern story. No Green Arrow. Sorry for the motorcycle in the distance, but nothing I could do about that. I hope it ends. Yes, thank you. Inked by Dick Giordano. It's a solo story. Hal Jordan goes for a hike in the woods, and he has some chili that he adds some mushrooms to. Mushrooms, eh? Yep, they were magic mushrooms. Denny O'Neil writes a story where Green Lantern trips on mushrooms, and yet he has to use his powering and save the person. Anyway, long story short, he's able to. And that's Neil's sign off. Now, if you had told me back in the day that the same month Neil would have a solo Green Lantern story, he would also, over at Marvel Comics, be debuting his version of Conan for the first time. Barry Smith drew it from 1970 to 73. John Buscema took it over. But here it is a year later. And Neil, I remember the talk of comics that Neil is finally going to do Conan and show us what he's capable of. Well, first of all, we have this alternate cover thumbnail sketch, Neil taking the same subject matter from a different angle. He tried it again this way. Interesting, though, he flopped it, and we end up with what seems like the obvious choice, but it's never obvious until you see the artist's work. Another story that Neil would pencil and ink himself. This is the year that comics printing at Marvel and DC really starts to go downhill. They use plastic plates, but as I show you these pages, folks, well, first of all, this, folks, is not a tight pencil. That's a thumbnail. But maybe because Neil was inking, he might have inked from this. This might have been tight enough for him, but I don't know. I think this is still a thumbnail. But what a beauty. Great coloring, too, in the flesh of the man's skin. But Glynis Wein, Len Wein's wife, is credited as colorist. And there's Neil's pencils and inks on Conan. Another page in the black and white. Neil, again, really was the only artist in mainstream comics that really drew convincing looking Black people. And no other artist had Neil's facility for drawing multiple races and genders in expressive, full of life positions and attitudes. Oh, I wanted to prepare you for this page. This keyboard really is sensitive. But yeah, look at the beauty of the coloring on the top. And then Neil's gorgeous thumbnail. Young artists, look how much work Neil puts into a thumbnail sketch to work out the composition so that when it's finally brought to finish, it looks like that. Anyway, a month later, May of '74, Neil does his first painted Conan cover for Marvel's magazine line, Savage Tales. There's that painting's thumbnail sketch. Then you get one version of the painting without all the type, and then how it gets color corrected and changed into looking like that. I don't know which version is the accurate version. Next month, June, he's doing another cover for Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. This particular piece we have in its non-type stage and it's black and white original. He's ping-ponging back and forth between Savage Tales covers and Kung Fu covers. But man, all that type is oppressive. Interesting original thumbnail. Man, look at that Conan drawing. But even the Khazar and the position of his head and the hand, beautiful. And there is one of his great Conan covers. But man, the type was really ugly and intrusive back in the early 70s. They really, to me, marred Neal's great work. So October 74, we end the year at National Lampoon, what seems to be a yearly tradition of Son of God. This time we're going to get Son of God's origin. Is that possible? The origin of Son of God? And how are they going to do it? Well, you got to track this story down, folks, and read it. I couldn't find quality reproduction, so you got to get a sense of the story. I thought I had this issue but in my collection, but I didn't. But basically, all the gods get together, and they need to have a new Messiah. And it's Jehovah's turn again after 2,000 years. And see, he says, it's my turn again. 2,000 years I've waited since I blew it with the last klutz I sent. But this time I checked with Mom, and have I got a Messiah for you? And check out this drawing of Neal's. Pre-computer, I love it. The printout of Son of God. But yes. And they chose, of course, Benny, whatever his name. So he goes to end it all in front of a subway train. And he yells out, Shalom. And that's how he becomes Son of God. Why me? God, why me? Yep. And during this time, he did other illustrations for National Lampoon in the early 70s. You know, things like this, spoofs of, boy, look closely at the credit. It says Neal, N-E-I-L. That must have driven him nuts. Now, this illustration was in my National Lampoon file, but I still think this is from Playboy, but I might be wrong. So anybody out there that can verify this. But man, check out the thumbnail drawing. This is the best resolution that exists, but you can get a sense of how much realism, even in Neal's thumbnail sketches, and the degree of finish. Other things for National Lampoon over the years, too many to show in this webinar, but no subject matter for Neal. He drew everything they asked of him. When Atlas Comics started up in 1974, that was Chip Goodman, the son of Marvin Goodman, or something like that. Or it's Marvin Goodman taking revenge against Stan Lee and launching his own comic line, ill-fated by, it was over by the end of 74, but Neal lent his talents to their kind of Conan character, Ironjaw. The next month, February 75, he's doing his take, a painting on the whole Chariots of the Gods concept that debuted in 1968. So here we are 7 years later. It's still a year before Kirby returns to Marvel with his take on Chariots of the Gods, the Eternals. Anyway, March of 75, Neal does his second Ironjaw cover. April, Star Reach, that was Mike Friedrichs' kind of prozine out of San Francisco. Of course, Neal and Friedrich created that great Batman story together of Silent Night of the Batman, the great Christmas story that I highlighted in my Batman webinar. And also Friedrich wrote the great Spectre 3 story to team up with Wildcat, where Neil really, that's where he began to wow us with his art. And then you get a series of paintings that he does for the Marvel magazine line that, again, I'm showing you the paintings first, just to show you how the type was just so intrusive and so ugly. I mean, I was never a fan of the Roger Moore Bond, but that's how it looked as cover. So we're moving through 1975. How about this pencil drawing? Becomes this Bruce Lee painting. But then look at what Marvel does with it. Instead of making it full bleed. In my sketchbook, I'm showing you this sketch of Khazar to show you how beautiful Neil turned it into a painting. But man, just Marvel had some of the worst type treatment, some of the worst graphic design. It's just crushes Neil's artwork. How about this thumbnail sketch of Neil's take on the creature of the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein, and Dracula? But that would become this painting, which would become yet another Marvel magazine cover with its schlocky type. But now we get into Neil's monster obsession of the 1970s that would result in a series of illustrated stories of Frankenstein, Dracula, and Wolfman. In my sketchbook, Neil explains it this way. My goal behind the Dracula Werewolf Frankenstein story was to take a story as if the first Dracula movie had been made, the first Frankenstein movie had been made, and the first werewolf movie had been made, but nothing else had been made since those first three movies. Now I was going to make a fourth movie that would include all these characters as though you were doing a comic book and have all the same elements, all changed, but all the same. This story would be that story. You'd have to move forward from those themes. I think it would make a great movie. To anybody who said my stuff is cinematic, this would be an example of how it's cinematic. Definitely this was laid out like scenes in a classic Frankenstein movie. Where I deviate from them, I do so for the sake of comic book fans. And where I stay for the sake of movie fans. So it's more movie done almost in storybook form. So over the course of the 1970s and 80s, Neil would work and rework these concepts in both black and white and color. And over the years and decades, it would take different formats. I think I'm showing you what Neil considered his state-of-the-art kind of finished version. But you can see in the level of artwork that Neil really loved these characters. He really loved playing around with these famous icons. The werewolf. Now, Neil loved drawing werewolves. Remember the Moon of the Wolf Batman story? But you can see it in his own inks in black and white. Inked and lettered. I mean, this is mid-70s prime Neil, folks. You know, and this is what he spent a lot of his seemingly downtime on in between other projects. But, you know, these versions of the werewolf, Dracula, and Frankenstein would appear in different licensing usages during the decade, like these 3D pieces he put together for Dynamite magazine. Now, Neil was an expert in 3D. For National Lampoon in the middle of 1975, he put together a whole series of 3D pages for them for the special 3D issue. Kind of was the art director of that issue in a way and did some of the finished art. There was a record company in the mid-70s, Power Records, that wanted to do children's records, semi-adult records. They had licensed certain stories from DC, Star Trek, and various things, and they needed stories. As often as not, I was writing the stories because I can knock out stories fairly quickly. I did a whole series of stories for Wonder Woman, Superman, and Star Trek. After a while, the people at Power Records said, we bought all these licenses, but they're a pain in the ass. Can we have you come up with a series of projects, which we'll pay you for? We'll license them from you, but we'll have you create them on given subjects. And I said, fine, I would do that. I'd create a series of licensable commodities. So I created a thing called Swamp Child. I created a thing called Dracula and Frankenstein because they were in the public domain. I was creating new stuff that I owned. So when you go from the thumbnail to the pencil and ink version to the final color version done on computer, but you can see this is the record. Oops, sorry about that. I forgot to have it dissolve. But yeah, this is the record that Neil was talking about. And I think this was the 45 RPM record. But yeah, Neil loved drawing Dracula. These are, again, various versions of the Dracula character. There's another 3D version of him. Creepy, huh? Speaking of creepy, as we're nearing the end of 1975 in November, this is not a cover by Neil, but inside is this particular story. You can see right away it's about a shooter. Now, we're all familiar with what looks like a lone shooter about to shoot innocent civilians. Now, this all started in American culture 9 years earlier, in 1966, when Charles Whitman in Texas, I think killed, was it 16 people? I'm not sure the amount, but it was worldwide media coverage. And 9 years later, Jan Sennstrom, a frequent Warren writer, comes up with this story, and Neil drew it. And in my mind, it's one of Neil's masterpieces of pure narrative comic book drawing. He used one of his continuity associates, Paul Krasner. Wait, I'm blanking on his name. I'm saying Paul Krasner. I hope I'm getting that right. Krassner. He became a great comic artist in his own right, but here he is posing with a dummied up gun for Neil's photo reference. Now, Neil had done illustrations prior to this that were based on the Kent State murders in 1970 by the National Guard. You can even see this piece exists that shows you that Neil had planned to do a docu-comic so far ahead of his time based on Kent State. But Neil's ability to draw realism like this is what he brought to Sennstrom's story called Thrill Kill. And you can even see in these thumbnails Neil's mastery of human anatomy and physics and how they would react to gunshots fired by a sniper. There's not a lot of photo reference for stuff like this, folks. Now, unfortunately, the Warren editor, Bill Dubay, who was also some kind of an artist, took Neil's art and added the most horrible, too dark gray tones with magic marker over not Neil's original art, but over versions of it. So thankfully, we have Neil's original art that I'm going to use to show you the story because the gray tones are too oppressive. There's another shot of Krasner. Boy, I can't believe I'm not getting his name right. I wish I could check that, but okay. Nevertheless, look at how Neil works that photo reference into one of his beautiful drawings on this page. So Neil is taking what he was known for, realistic human expressions, and applying them to the real world. And folks, this story is so far ahead of its time because based on recent events, I mean, are you kidding me? This looks like this could have been written and drawn yesterday. How about that bottom right panel? Once again, Neil understands the physics of motion, of how glass shatters. He's studied photographs, live action film, and he's able to duplicate it on a still picture plane in two-dimensional form. Each panel is worthy of study. Oh, those bottom four panels are just, each one is a masterpiece of pen and ink drawing. I mean, the naturalism of the guy taking an apple out of his lunch bag in between all the carnage. There's that photo reference. I mean, people have made movies since then that look like this, but this is 1975, folks. Every panel is just a primer of pen and ink drawing, spotting of blacks. The text has been a psychiatrist talking with a reporter, I think, about analyzing the killer. Hell for him was earth, so he left it for heaven where he hoped to find a better place. Now at least he didn't have to go alone. This panel ended up being used as the back panel of IDW's recent reprint of the original art called Thrill Kill Artist Edition, where for a relatively cheap price, you get facsimile reproductions of all 10 pages that I just showed you. So what better way to end the year 1975 with the second publication of Neil's work that came out, The Art of Neal Adams. Now, this incredible cover, one of my favorite, all-time favorite Neil images, it started out as a thumbnail sketch that looked like that. There is a low-res version of the black and white art. I don't know if Neil colored this originally, but that's the original coloring. And then I don't know who came up with the idea of giving it to the great late Richard Corbin and that beautiful pink sky against the green Hulk. And then the tasteful type. By the way, that's Atomic Mouse, a Charlton Comics knockoff of Mighty Mouse, sorry, that Neil had a fondness for and would stick him in between his very rugged male superheroes. On the back cover, another masterpiece by Neil, colored by Corbin. Neil's take on Will Eisner's The Spirit. There's the original, or the, I don't know if that's a thumbnail or a tight pencil. It could be a thumbnail, but man, look at the detail. I love Neil's spirit face. It both pays homage to the cartooniness of Eisner's, but keeps it in Neil's realism. In that issue, in that collection, Art of Neal Adams, it was the first time we saw alternate covers like this, mezzotint images like this. And since I'm a football fan, I really enjoy Neil's Hawkman meets the NFL. The real revelation in this issue was two pieces of artwork. One piece that looked like this, which we would later find out was based on a collaboration Neil had with Eric Burdon, the great English rock and roller. Looked like this in the 70s. In the 60s, of course, when he was with the Animals, he looked like this. In the early 70s, after the Animals, he joined War. But this was a project he was working on with Neil that would be, again, ahead of its time, a kind of a graphic novel version of the lyrics to a concept album. And you can see it's all about a rock star and violence and protest. It's very 1960s, early 70s. Look at how Neil used this famous photograph that was published in late 60s, early 70s. That's how you use photo reference, folks. And then obviously the lyrics, they deal with Native American issues, and this is what probably attracted Eric Burdon to Neil. But the project was aborted. I think Burdon, classic early 70s, it might have been a drug and alcohol problem. I don't know. Years later, he would put out an album of some of the themes that he explored there called Mirage. Neil would work with other rock acts and do illustrations like this in the 1970s, a classic Roger Daltrey and The Who. The Great American Band, Grand Funk Railroad. That's Neil in his Mort Druckery Mad Magazine type style. And how about this thing he did with Kiss? I mean, these are things that, I don't know, never saw the light of day, but that's Neil's pencil. And this looks like, I don't know, it's like semi-ink, tight penciled. You know, these are the things that you find on the internet and there's no explanation. So we're in the middle of 1976, June, back to National Lampoon. And we get this really offbeat final appearance of Neil's Son of God, done as a single page text piece. I think it was written by Sean Kelly. But you can see the beautiful drawing by Neil based on the classic poster of Dustin Hoffman's Lenny, based on Lenny Bruce. By the way, if you've never seen it, this is one of the great films in the 1970s, directed by, of course, Bob Fosse. But it's funny how Neil is keeping with these themes. In the middle of 1976, he puts out this cover for the French magazine, French science fiction magazine. But yeah, that looks like Christ in space. So funny how he's doing these things at the same time. With continuity, he did a series of comic books based on the $6 Million Man for Charlton, and he did the painted covers for them. There was also a comic book, a magazine. This is all in 1975. Wait, are we in 75 or 76? No, we're in 76. I'm sorry. But you can see Neil did the thumbnail layouts, and all of his continuity artists, pencilers and inkers, would finish off the work with Neil kind of supervising, and the finished work would look like this. Here's, I think, the last of his paintings, September 76. You can see it starts out as a drawing, thumbnail, and there's the painting of it with his watercolor dyes and the finish. Part of Neil's continuity advertising work in the mid-70s, starting in 76, he did the comic book ads that were in the comic books for CBS's Saturday morning lineup, probably because they did have superheroes like Captain Marvel and Isis, and then you can see with Tarzan. So probably a lucrative illustration assignment, that's for sure. The same year in 76, we got the third Neal Adams magazine, the Neal Adams Treasury. Now that's a cover of one of his future Tarzan paperbacks that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Inside was another long, great interview with Neal, peppered with great sketches like you see here. But what this particular issue had was one of Neal's great Conan drawings. Now, speaking of Conan, that year, that September, this is not his cover. This is an Earl Norham cover. But inside is a story called Shadows and Zambula, written by Roy Thomas, that Neal wanted to be his Conan magnum opus after he had done that one color issue in 1974. Or what was that? 73, I'm sorry. And to make a long story short, Neal thumbnailed the entire, I think it was a 48-page Conan story, or maybe it was longer, 72 pages, I don't know. But you can see that this is typically how Neal would take its design. That's an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper split up into 4 quadrants. So the top 2 pages are, the top half is a one double page spread, and the bottom half is another double page spread. You can see the same thing here. Now, these are thumbnails, folks, but Neal was planning on penciling and inking this. And he asked Roy Thomas, who was also the editor, to give him an open-ended deadline because he needed the time to do this job right. But he wanted it to be his Conan magnum opus. Well, here's the problem. The story was taken away from him. Roy Thomas actually took Neal's thumbnails, gave it to a bunch of Filipino artists under, I think, the head Tony DeZuniga, but I'm not sure. I think Tony DeZuniga was the lead inker. But the Filipino artists were called the Tribe. They were sort of the counterparts of Neal's inkers, who were called the Crusty Bunkers. But you can see how this is not what Neal intended. It's a shadow of Neal's work. Here's the finished Tribe thing where you can get a sense of Neal's work. And Neal's thumbnail, the Tribe penciled and inked the story off of Neal's thumbnails. You like that, folks? I don't think Neal ever forgave Roy Thomas, and there's a whole backstory to why Roy Thomas did what he did. And that's something we can talk about in the chat room later. So when you see finished images like this, while they might be nice, when you see Neal's thumbnails, we'll never know what it might have looked like had Neal brought it to finish. This gives you a good idea. That's Neal's. Neal went in and inked a few figures before it was given to the Tribe. So look at Neal's inking of the black man on the left. That's a very dark African man. And it called for a very special inking approach. And then look at how the Tribe on the right tried to approximate it. It's horrible. We can only imagine what Neal might have done with these thumbnails. And why was Neal requesting an open-ended deadline from Roy Thomas when he started this in 1974? He was a little bit busy doing stuff like this. In the mid-70s, starting in 74, Neal became aware of the Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster case, where, if you know the story, they were the creators of Superman. They signed the rights away and yada, 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 lost all rights. We're in debt. We're living on the poverty line. And Jerry Siegel, the writer on the left there, wrote a newspaper article about his plight that got to Neal's attention. And again, to make a long story short, Neal pooled his resources. And that is the great Jerry Robinson, the president of the National Cartoonist Society, on the right. Bob Kane's first Batman ghost artist in 1939, co-creator of the Joker and of Robin. But Neal used him to help him get Siegel and Schuster eventually stipends for the rest of their life from Warner Brothers, which owns DC Comics, and their credit on Superman in perpetuity. But that's why Neal was too busy with all of his other commercial artwork. He asked Roy for an opening deadline, but Roy Thomas had to make that deadline and took the thumbnails out from under Neal. It's really the desecration of what would have been Neal's, and it kind of ruined Neal in Marvel Comics. He never really did anything after it for them. He was too busy at DC Comics, not only with Siegel and Schuster, but right around that time, Jeanette Kahn became the new president and publisher of DC Comics, succeeding Carmine Infantino. And I think Neal and Jeanette Kahn also had some kind of affair, which I witnessed at a comic convention with my own eyes in 1976. They were making out in broad daylight in the middle of a convention audience. So other people were witnesses, folks. But the bottom line is Jeanette Kahn was responsible for the late 20th century kind of revival of DC Comics to become a major player with Marvel, who had superseded it. And her relationship with Neal got him to kind of come back to DC after not doing anything for them for a bunch of years, starting in '76 with the book cover for this coffee table compilation. And then in '77, a series of covers that would be a kind of a Neal 2.0. This was one of his greatest. Again, a lot of type, but look at the sketch, the thumbnail, and how much of it was in there, how much drama and excitement and energy. And then the penciled and inked version. And back to the finished color. The next one, January, that was, I think, '76. This is January of '77. Great Justice League cover. There's the, again, thumbnail. Maybe that's a quarter of a page of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. The next month, he does another JLA cover where, once again, great thumbnail sketch. And the finish. And then he returned to House of Mystery. If you attended my first Eclectica webinar last week, you saw all the House of Mystery covers that he did. This time around, oh, does the cover for GI Combat. By the way, beautiful coloring. You can see in the black and white version. I think Neal only inked this. It says Russ Heath, or maybe Russ Heath inked it. Huh. There's another House of Mystery cover. You know, too much type on top really, you know, crowds these covers, all the blurbs. Neal never had to contend with that in his early covers. But again, Neal drew babies like nobody else. Also in '77, he does things like this. Neal made himself available for fanzines. In the fall of '77, he does his second CBS ad for their Saturday morning lineup. And there's his last House of Mystery cover. Inside the comic books, there appeared this ad for the art of Neal Adams #2. Huh. So this now marks the third Adams publication with another Atomic Mouse cover. There's the black and white. Beautiful inking. And the finish. The back cover has one of Neal's barbarian types. Nice watercolor painting there. Neal would do sometimes mainstream covers like this. We're in the middle of '78 now. New Times. Hot Stuff, that's a kind of a comic book underground prozine. And really, again, great body posture, body English, different types, different races, the very swishy gay man on the left. And that, of course, leads us into his 1978 masterworks, his Tarzan paperback paintings. That, I mean, take your pick on what you like the best, but here's how they look like mocked up with the type. He did, I think, 12. They wanted him to do 24, but again, Neal, because of all his commitments, I think they took the series out from him after he did 12, but man, the 12 he did are all beauties. I love the circular composition of motion of this one. Remember that from The Art of Neal Adams? So he had been working on these for a couple of years before they were published in 78. Now, I think before the paperback covers, Neal did this thing for Aurora where they did a Tarzan model set. So he did all the packaging, and then it also came with a comic book insert that Mark Hannerfeld, the late Mark Hannerfeld, wrote. The coloring is a little harsh, but this is Neal's only interior Tarzan story. A couple more pages that I didn't show you, and the printing is weird. I was only able to find this low-res version, but that's a beautiful jungle. That's meant to be the backdrop for your Tarzan model. Meanwhile, speaking of Tarzan, for National Lampoon, he does this drawing that gets marked up by the writer or the editor. And it eventually becomes this illustration, which is called The Greater Threat. In 1979, we get the second Neal Adams Treasury, which features another iconic Conan pose by Neal, and yet another one. So because Zambula crashed and burned, we only ever got to see Neal's Conan in fits and starts, like fanzine covers like this, or like this. And you never knew where Neal's work would pop up during those years. In 1979, Archie Super, that's not even a cover by Neal. Or is it? But the interior was by Neal, penciled and inked. The Black Hood. These are the best reproductions I could find. I thought I had the issue in my collection. But coloring was really nice. And again, why all of a sudden would he pencil ink a Black Hood? I don't know. There is the 1978, or maybe we're in 78 or 79. I think this is 79, maybe. This is a 79 World's Finest cover. Yeah, that was September, right? Kind of a Batman. Meanwhile, 1979, they were putting together Superman 2. And from my sketchbook, we get this Superman illustration. And Neal says, back when the second Superman movie was being made, circa 1980, I was designing toy packaging and was asked to design a Superman that sort of looked like Christopher Reeve, but was still basically the comic book Superman. Well, it's about this time that Neal debuts what he called his new heroes for the 80s. This was published in 1979 as a portfolio of drawings. Now check out this little English publication. That's England, Forbidden Planet. They got Neal Adams to come over and promote the new heroes portfolio. So this is 1979. Neal is 38 years old, in his prime. very proud of his new heroes. So here's what they look like, folks. You might recognize most of them. Crazy Man. These were characters Neil would play with over the next decades. Shaman. King Tut looks very Bruce Lee influenced. The Man from Future Past. Titan, kind of a Conan type character. Actually looks more like that Killraven. Toy Boy, based on his son Jason. And the kind of leader of the group, Ms. Mystic. She was the most ready for prime time, so to speak. So the comic book media covered this. Again, this is circa 1980. And the first issue of Ms. Mystic for the brand new publisher, Pacific Comics, that caused quite a stir. There was also a second issue, I believe in 1981, for Marvel's Epic magazine in 81. Neil painted this cover. And in the very next issue, in July of 81, no, I'm sorry, 2 issues later, or maybe this was 1 issue, under a Barry Smith cover, we were treated to, remember that Eric Burden story from 1975 or 3 or earlier in the 70s? Well, Neil finally puts it all together, colors it, and it gets printed in Epic. Now, the printing is weird. I made the best reproductions I could find, but it's a masterpiece. There's nothing else like it. And Neil is not really known for it, but as I show you these pages, forget about what even the story's about, because we don't have time to go into the story, but you can just see that it's a world-spanning post-1960s. The Native American ideas are in there, the Vietnam War. I mean, pages you remember seeing in black and white, but it looks like the whole story of America. Remember the rock and roll page? Like I said, the coloring, I'm not too crazy about it. And the printing in Epic is really kind of a shoddy print job. But the raw artwork looks really phenomenal, like nothing else Neil ever really did. And, you know, it's not superheroes. It's real people. It's real life. And then it goes off into this kind of Stanley Kubrick psychedelic fantasy outer space thing. Like I said, you've never seen any Neil artwork like this, but is that the universe giving birth? Is that Gaia, the earth goddess? I mean, folks, have you ever seen anything like this? Nobody could have done this art other than Neil this particular way. And he ends it like this. They have learned the lesson life has to teach them, and this time they'll not make the same mistakes. It would be as easy to do it wrong as it was the last time, but they've learned their lesson, haven't they? So from space opera to earth opera. In the 80s, Neil's artwork could do anything through continuity. Ads like this, comic book style ads, look, for Cracker Jacks in Neil's cartoonier style. The Adventures of Milkman. And then, you know, 1983, Neil climbs aboard the craze back then for roller skating and roller disco or whatever the hell it was. And soon after, Neil debuts his own line of continuity comics with his character based on his son, Joel, is kind of continuity Superman megalith. Now, over the next years and decades, Neil would play with this character. I mean, 10 years later, maybe, this was a megalith cover by Neil. So you can see the way Neil took his art. It became, in the 21st century, it became more abstract, more exaggerated, like amped up on steroids or on acid, maybe. He put out an anthology magazine in the 80s and 90s, Echo of Future Past. There's one of his, I don't think this was a used Tarzan cover by Bantam Books. Here's another painted cover by Neil with the character Tippy Toe Jones, created by Lindley Farley. If you're listening, Lindley, I'm a shout out to you. Of the characters Neil created for continuity, the only one I thought was really interesting was his kind of take on Batman meets, I don't know, Spawn, called Nighthawk. I really like this particular cover. That's a classic Neil face. The great computer coloring works to the advantage of making the realism work. I love the eyes. That's really a beautiful image. Neil did things that were crazy. This was a die-cut cover that was based on the, profile of Crazy Man. Also in the 80s, Neil repackaged in a slipcase edition his Green Lantern, Green Arrow series with brand new covers that were redone versions of his early covers. Not redone, but I mean new versions of his old covers, not just, traced versions. These are brand new pieces of art, newly colored. And then, in the 21st century, a magazine would come calling to do a Green Lantern cover, and Neil would return to some of his famous poses and update them. Or DC would hire him to do new covers like this. In the 21st century, Neil got to wrap up projects that he had been working on for decades, like his Monsters collection. And he would do a whole slew of covers for so many publishers, this being one of my favorite, this Captain Marvel cover. And in many ways, I see this as being emblematic of Neil himself. Neil was a Marvel. He was a captain of sorts, and he was a New York City-based artist. And in many ways, this was Neil, this godlike artist, genius character hovering above New York City. I mean, doing the work that he gave us while the rest of us mortals underneath oohed and awed at what he turned out. So Neil was not only a great comic book artist, but a great American artist and a great New Yorker. This being one of the most emblematic images of the 21st century, and Neil did his version of it. And I think it really sums up Neil himself in the 21st century as the icon he became and the icon he always was from the very beginning. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of these memorial webinars that I started with. This great Dead Man work where he made his bones, bringing Batman back to being a creature of the night, his definitive Green Lantern, Green Arrow series with Denny O'Neil, his Marvel works, his significant body of Superman works that culminated in the Muhammad Ali project, his eclectic works from 62 to 71 that I covered last week, and now finishing up tonight with the balance of his career. And as much as I could show, and even then, I said it would be about 2 hours, but in many ways, folks, we started out covering Neil literally from before 1962, from when he was born in 41. So to Neal, I tip my cap to you as a father figure. My own father died when I was 4 months old, and based on the eulogies that came out, you were father to many, Neal. So thank you for who you were and the work you gave us and the person you were, the dynamic force you were in people's lives, least of which my own. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, you'll see information on comic book history and my book, The Silver Age of Comic Art, of which Neal has a chapter, of course. I run a Facebook group on the Silver Age, one on just Jack Kirby's work and one, of course, on Neal Adams' work. He influenced my illustration style the most, doing comic book art, but for advertising and magazines. One of my specialties is keeping the photographic look of real people, but turning them into superheroes. My website is linked to the commercial site TeePublic, where I show over 100 of my illustrations in various t-shirt, posters, knickknacks, gewgaws, thingamabobs, and every application you can think of. So support your local freelance artists, folks. And then there's my visual lectures and webinars that are linked to my YouTube and Vimeo channels. My Vimeo channel has all the webinars that have copyrighted content that YouTube's lawyers usually flag. So whatever's on my YouTube channel, like all my recent Neal webinars, made it through YouTube's lawyers. Anyway, folks, starting on July 6th, I'll be debuting a summertime web series of all the 8 artists in my book, The Silver Age of Comic Art. So if you go to NewYorkAdventureClub.com, you'll be able to find information about that. And starting tomorrow, I'll be posting information about it on my events blog page, which always has my comings and goings and all the URL links you'll need. So thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this webinar, honoring Neal Adams, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.